All right, we ready to go? Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Thursday, June 12th Congestion Management Committee meeting. So I'll read the notice of non-discrimination. You are invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. You can read the full notice of your rights and protections at www.bostonmpo.org/MPO_non_discrimination. Next slide. This is our accessibility statement. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, or if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Olivia Sequoia, MPO staff at osaccocia@ctps.org or 857-702-3705 or in the chat box. Meeting guidelines for today. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After roll call, board members may mute them and unmute themselves. Always remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. You can find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. Please raise your hand via Zoom if you'd like to use an AI note taker during this meeting. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. Next slide. All right, start with the introductions. Olivia, do you want to call the roll?
Yes. City of Everett.
Jay Monty, City of Everett, and committee chair.
City of Boston.
Denver, representing Mayor Michelle Wu in the City of Boston.
Three Rivers Interlocal Council.
Steve Olenoff, representing the Trick Subregion.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins Advisory Council here.
MassDOT.
MassDOT Highway, John Romano here.
And Massport. Town of Arlington.
It's John Alessi with the Town of Arlington.
And MBTA Advisory Board. All right, I think that's everyone here.
Right, next item, public comments. Any members of the public wish to speak? Seeing none, we'll move on to action item, approval of the April 24th, 2025 meeting minutes. Anybody have a motion to approve?
I move we approve those minutes.
John Alessi?
Yeah, I'll second that motion.
All right, motion a second. Call the roll.
Jay Monty.
Yes.
Jen Rowe.
Yes.
Steve Olenoff.
Yes.
Len Diggins.
Diggins, yes.
John Romano.
John Romano, yes.
John Alessi.
John Alessi, yes.
Okay, that motion carries.
Great. All right, move on to item number 4. So this is a presentation for roadway pricing discrete study. It's the introduction, and do you want me to introduce both Joe and Rose now, or just Joe for now, and then? Rose later.
I think Rose and Joe both can
Okay.
do the introductions now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we have a couple of staff members from CTPS who have been working very hard on this with Priyanka. We have Joe Delorto, who's a data analyst with the Project Analysis and Applications team at CTPS. He'll be the main presenter for this presentation. And Joe is working on the ongoing roadway pricing study along with Rose McCarran, who's the manager of Project Analysis and Applications, as well as Seth Strumwasser, who's a data analyst with CTPS data management team. So this is one of the discrete studies chosen by the MPO for funding in this previous fiscal year 2025. So with that, I will hand it over to Joe and Priyanka.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. As Jay mentioned, my name is Joe Delorto. I'm a data analyst in the Project Analysis and Applications group, CTPS. Today, I will be presenting to you about and soliciting your feedback about the ongoing roadway pricing UPWP study. Next slide, please. So first, just to establish what we'd like to accomplish in this meeting, we'll begin by going over the project, its scope of work, and what our goals are for this study. Provide you an update with the work we've completed so far and what remains to accomplish before the end of the federal fiscal year. And then after that, we'll move into a more active discussion where we'll seek input from the committee members on different roadway pricing scenarios that we could use in that analysis as we move into the analysis phase of this work. Next slide, please. So the roadway pricing study is funded through the federal fiscal year 2025 Unified Planning Work Program. And the work is really taking a data-focused approach to studying roadway pricing and estimating what its impacts could be in the Boston region. Given the time and scope of this work, we see this as an exploratory exercise to understand what data and analytical tools are available to us as we explore roadway pricing. We roadway pricing analyses and identify any gaps that may exist in the available data to answer the kinds of questions that we're interested in. We're looking to identify what key questions people in the region are interested in and what metrics we can use to help answer those questions. And this work will help prepare us to examine a conceptual roadway pricing scenario in the Boston region. At a high level, we're aiming to analyze the congestion, revenue, and equity impacts of roadway pricing in the region. We also want to evaluate our own capacity to conduct these kinds of analyses and contribute to the ongoing regional conversation around roadway pricing. However, it's important to point out at the beginning here that the study is not trying to suggest what a system should look like. The goal of the study is not to present a thoroughly vetted proposal for a system of roadway pricing, but to examine some of these key questions at a high level and provide a starting point for data-driven and informed discussions about roadway pricing in the region. Next slide, please. So as far as work that we've completed up to this point, the study began with a research and literature review process. We looked at studies of existing roadway pricing systems and their impacts, both domestically and internationally. One of the studies that was very helpful to us was the MPO's Learning from Roadway Pricing Experiences study from a few UPWP cycles ago. And I know this committee was very involved with that work and championed that work, so we want to express our appreciation for that. We also looked at other analyses of proposed roadway pricing systems, including conceptual systems in Los Angeles and San Francisco, as well as some pre-implementation analyses of the congestion pricing system in New York. We've also done a fair amount of data exploration to understand what data is available to support our analysis. We've looked at travel behavior from sources like Replica and the US Census to understand where, how, and why people are traveling and who would be impacted by roadway pricing. We've looked at vehicle congestion data from RIDIS and INRIX, helping to identify the corridors or subregions that could benefit the most from a system of roadway pricing. We've also used the CMP multimodal network to understand how these travel patterns and corridors overlap with transit coverage throughout our region. And we've also done some work to identify potential scenarios that we could analyze later in the study. Broadly, these fall into three categories: cordon pricing, such as the new congestion pricing system in New York; corridor-based pricing, like the sort of express lane systems in DC or the Bay Area; and parking pricing. And we'll get into more detail about what each of these types of systems mean in a moment. Next slide, please. And so as far as what's left to do, we're hoping to accomplish a couple of things here today in our upcoming discussion. Given the size, scope, and timeline of this study, we'll be able to estimate some of the impacts of one roadway pricing scenario. And so the goal for this discussion today is to get feedback from the committee members on the different types of scenarios, with any questions, concerns, preferences, or other feedback about the different scenario types we present. But also, given the time available to us, we really want to prioritize analyzing the questions and metrics that you all feel are most pertinent to our region as we begin to explore the impacts of roadway pricing in Greater Boston. So after this discussion, we're hoping to shortly begin the analysis process, and that will be followed up by documenting our process and results. I think we're good to go to the next slide. So the next item here is the actual discussion as well. So we can go ahead to the next slide. Once more, I'll just jump right into it here. First, we'll talk about the different roadway pricing scenarios that we've been looking at, and then we'll talk about some of the key questions and metrics that some of you had identified in the survey and things that have come up in our research, and then we'll have an open discussion about that. So, as I mentioned, the roadway pricing scenarios we're looking at broadly fall into three categories. We'd like to get your input on any preferences, questions, or concerns that you have about us analyzing a particular style of roadway pricing system. So one of these systems is cordon-based roadway pricing, which is where drivers pay a fee for driving within a defined boundary. These types of systems are often called downtown congestion pricing or simply congestion pricing. And of course, the notable domestic example of this is the New York Central Business District tolling program that was recently launched. Another type of roadway pricing system is corridor-based pricing, which involves tolling specific roadways, usually controlled access highways. Often these tolls are dynamically priced and will respond to traffic to maintain a given speed on that roadway. One example of this, as I mentioned, is the Bay Area Express lanes, although there are many examples of express lane or high occupancy toll lane systems throughout the country. Often these kinds of lanes are built to augment existing highway infrastructure. In the case of our region, this would likely be tolling for access to existing highway facilities rather than assuming any sort of large new investment in highway infrastructure. The other type of system we've been considering is parking pricing, which involves dynamic pricing of on-street municipal parking to control demand, encourage parking turnover, and hopefully shift some trips to non-auto modes. The best example of this domestically is Washington, D.C., which operated a pilot program in their Chinatown and Penn Quarter neighborhoods to this effect. Next slide, please. Pardon me. So we're also interested in hearing about what key questions and metrics regarding roadway pricing are of interest to stakeholders throughout the region, and this will really shape our analysis. We want to prioritize the questions and metrics that the committee members are most interested in the time that we have available. And so here we have some key questions that other analyses have attempted to answer, as well as some of the, related to the questions that you all brought up in the survey, and thank you all for filling out that survey before this meeting. And some of the metrics that we can potentially use to help answer these questions. So the first question here is, what is the potential for congestion mitigation? Here's where there's tools like the MPO's travel demand model could be helpful in answering some of these questions. We could attempt to estimate the shift away from auto modes towards transit, walking, or biking. We can look at decreases in estimated vehicle volumes, and we can also look at the impact on regional travel times. We can also compare the model results to the results of real-world roadway pricing systems like New York's. Next, a question that a lot of folks expressed interest in through the survey, and one that came up in the scope looking at the equity impacts in particular, is who would be impacted by roadway pricing? We could estimate the relative equity impacts of roadway pricing by looking at the demographics of drivers and transit users. We could also examine the geographical flows of trips by looking at origins and destinations, and seeing how many auto trips are, proximal to transit where they could feasibly be replaced by transit. We can also examine traffic diversions to alternative routes through the travel demand model. As well, there's a lot of interest in what is the potential revenue. This would be a product of the price we set for the system in this scenario, and how many vehicles we estimate would continue to use the roadways given that price. And something that also came up a lot in the survey was the environmental impacts of roadway pricing, especially the impact on vehicle emissions. This is another area where the travel demand model and the experiences of other regions who have implemented roadway pricing could help us estimate the impact on various communities throughout our region, both in terms of CO2 emissions and criteria pollutant emissions. So next slide, please. And so now we can move into the discussion portion of our presentation here today. We're not going to decide firmly on a scenario today or on any particular metrics today, but we do want to get your feedback on which aspects of roadway pricing you're most interested in, to understand either how it applies to this study or potentially the development of future studies or tools that we could use to examine roadway pricing. So yeah, I do have a few questions here if we want to, but if anybody has any opening thoughts, can feel free. I saw Dan's hand up first.
All right. Yeah, we'll start with Dan. Go ahead. Somebody needs to unmute Dan. Dan, you're on mute. I think we need to have somebody unmute you. Can we come back to Dan? We'll start with Jen, and we'll come back to you, Dan. Is that all right?
Sure, yeah. I guess first a quick, would you be willing to kind of go back to that previous slide? I think it could be helpful in, yeah, these key questions and metrics. And yeah, I think I'll maybe start off the discussion saying, I mean, like excellent job in like I think distilling like in this set of questions and sample metrics feel like correct to me, or like a good definitely very much of interest. One note just from a municipal perspective, like certainly understanding where the like kind of where we might need to make investments in the transit network, like where there isn't necessarily good access, whether for transit or via like good biking, walking routes would be helpful. So I think like those sort of fall into that like impact area. But I kind of see any kind of movement that we would make towards pricing roadways as like would need to be advancing a suite of other projects to kind of accommodate other options.
I'm unmuted now. Sorry about that. My system froze up. I think it's important that we have a stepped approach of pricing so that we don't the beginning and ramp it up. The reason for that is we need to induce more walking and cycling and mass transit use. And we don't have the infrastructure all there yet, especially within the Boston space. So I think it's important that we don't penalize the drivers quite heavily yet until we can get some funds to really push forward in making more pathways viable, especially here in Charlestown where I live. We don't have the pathways to get in and out of the city efficiently. We're working on it, but it's going to take years, unfortunately. We need to think longevity here, not short term. And that's a very important piece. I'm all for this. I don't care which model you go with, but it's just a matter of, you're going to penalize the wrong people, and you don't want to do that. And that is, the walkers and the riders, and then the small intra Boston area residential spaces. That's it.
Thanks, Dan. Len?
Thanks, Jay. Well, Joe, if you don't mind, Jay, you said you had some questions, so I can step back a little bit and let you then put up discussion questions and then give my input.
Yeah, that's fine with me. Let's do that, Joe.
Great. So this is the first question I have here. So we have sort of the list of metrics here. We saw in the survey that mode shift was a common point of interest among committee members. And are there any other particular metrics either listed here or not listed here that you are particularly interested in or have any questions about as that we might analyze?
Okay, I'll think about that. But certainly, I mean, I'm interested in the parking pricing the most because I think that would have the ability to increase mode shift, pull in some revenue, and perhaps minimize I won't say unintended. But I mean, if you price a route, and there are alternative routes, that aren't, don't have an increase in pricing, people would divert onto those routes, unless there's some measure put into place, to avoid that, so I think it'll give people the most flexibility, to determine how and when they want to change, their own behavior, especially if the parking pricing was dynamic. So that's that's my primary suggestion. My other concern, but kind of maybe we'll set the ground for future studies, is that you're pulling data from models that already exist, for pricing, and I think there are other models that either aren't in that set, or that we haven't thought of, or that aren't in implementation, and I don't know how we will explore those models, if all we have is this set of models from which to draw. And I understand the data-driven approach, I'm all for that. But let's say we have a model that doesn't exist, then how do we explore potentially that model? Certainly, it seems like that's not something you want to do in this study, but I'd like to see us create a mechanism or a means in this study so that we can explore some other models, because people have heard about my thoughts about this. I won't go into it again here, and that just isn't a possibility of exploration, as I see it in this study. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Len. Steve Olnoff.
Yeah, so you list these sample metrics here, and I want to make sure, and especially people that just might be reading something like this, they're not confusing that with goals, because some of these are not really goals. Certainly, the mode shift is the big goal, but the reduction in travel time is not actually a goal. It measures how. I mean, obviously, vehicle reduction in vehicle volumes is something you want, and that'll probably result in a reduction in travel times, but that's not a goal, because once travel times go down, more people will look and say, okay, I'd rather drive now because it's taking less time. So I think just want to be careful in these that you express somewhere else, and maybe you've already done that, what the actual goals are here, rather than these simple metrics.
Thanks, Steve. And Joe, if you want to respond to anybody, feel free to jump in before I go to the next speaker, or Rose as well.
Yeah, I'd like to just jump in and respond to Steve on that. And I think that's a really great point. And, that's something we want to be really careful about with the framing of this study. This is a very, very small building block in how the MPO can build up their ability to support things like this and this type of analysis. And so our goal here is to build up our capacity to do that and understand where we don't have capacity. Setting goals for a congestion pricing program is a bigger conversation that's going to happen outside of the project analysis and applications team at the MPO. So we want to make space for that conversation to happen elsewhere, but you make a good point that it's very clear that that's not what we're doing here in this study.
Great. Thanks, Rose. John Alessi.
Thanks, Jay. And Joe, thanks for your presentation here. One of the questions I had that I'd be interested through this study is, what are the trips that are being made by vehicles today that could be like transit? I'm thinking about how, there are probably a lot of commuters, say, from some of the suburbs that have access to commuter rail. Maybe they're driving from their towns into downtown Boston. And I think to myself, how many of those trips could have been made by commuter rail, but maybe there's just a, maybe it's the cost that makes it less appealing. Maybe it's kind of maybe the train takes a slight bit longer. I'd be curious about kind of what the potential is for transit. I know MassDOT has a couple of data sets like the potential for walking and biking, maybe the potential for transit. So getting some data on that, like which could feed into the reduction of vehicle volumes. I'd be curious if that could be addressed in this study.
Yeah, that's one of the things that the sort of trip behavior, trip origin, destination data, like particularly from Replica, allows us to do is to see sort of where trips are coming from and going to very specifically. So we can see how many trips are proximal to a transit station that are headed to downtown Boston or another sort of transit hub that, you know, could feasibly be replaced by transit. And then similarly, as if we're thinking about designing a cordon, for example, we want to make sure that the trips that are going there, that there's decent transit coverage, that we're not including places that are difficult to get to or onerous to get to on transit, so that we're not, you know, punishing, like you said, punishing drivers for, you know, making trips that aren't easily, you know, transferable over to transit.
No, that's great to hear. Thank you.
Genro.
Thank you. One kind of, I guess maybe a subdivision of a metric that I'd be interested in is on that reduction in travel times. Like I'm actually, you know, quite interested in that as a goal, both because I think, and I'd be interested specifically in understanding reduction in travel times for that could be expected by our bus system. And so understanding like how what like the degree to which this could make taking the bus a much more attractive option, with the assumption that the buses would not be paying the tolls, but could you know, benefit from a reduction in single occupancy vehicles. So maybe some like disentangling of that.
Great, thanks, Jen. Rosa, see your hand still up. Is that just from earlier, or do you want to? All right, Len, go ahead.
I mean, I like what Jim said. I mean, especially reduction in travel time for transit riders. I mean, so that even if there is a reduction in transit travel time for people in vehicles, they still see the benefit of using transit, especially if they throw other factors in that may, you know, be more closely linked with their values. But what I was going to add is a change in not so much the amount of time of travel, but a change in the travel times themselves. So do people shift when they go from point A to point B, especially if they are commuting to work? And certainly that's not completely under their control in a lot of cases, but it may be that we can also do things to help businesses realize the value, maybe, you know, shifting the shifts, so as to reduce the congestion, because that can also free up some resources. Because if we have to provide a lot of resources for these short periods of time when everyone's traveling, it's just inefficient. And so if we can spread that out, it's just much more efficient in terms of the physical resources you need to have and the human resources you need to have. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Len. Any other comments or questions from committee members? Jen?
Just throwing one other element, and I'm not sure actually how feasible this is. This data is available, but I'd be curious about like specifically reduction in travel times where there's around like medical centers or like other places that, you know, fire stations, like places where we, you know, maybe particularly interested in seeing, yeah, less congestion.
All right, any other committee member comments? All right, before I go to Dan, I see your hand up, and I'm just gonna have you comment in the public comment time period.
Oh, I just want to add one point supporting Jen's position. First, last mile is a key to make the pathways more efficient and move people more quickly.
All right, thanks, Dan. So Joe and Rose, I don't know if you had any sort of closing comments or next steps you want to share before we move on.
Yeah, just to say that this is all excellent feedback. I did want to provide just quickly an opportunity if any committee members wanted to share if they've thought about any of the differences between the different types of systems we've presented, like a cordon versus corridor versus parking pricing, or if they have any sort of particular preferences or reservations about any of them. Just wanted to provide space for that as well before we close.
Steve.
Well, could you explain more about the parking pricing, because it only affects the, as you're saying, the on-street parking, the parking meters. But in Boston, there are more garage parking than there is on-street parking. So how is, if you only have control over one, how is that going to have an effect? Do you somehow need control over both? And should that be included?
So my understanding of the Washington DC program is that it was limited to on-street parking, and so they would they had a sort of set neighborhood region, and they would sort of shift the parking pricing in that to sort of shift parking to where there was more parking available, or to encourage people to not drive and park to Chinatown at all, because that's an area with pretty good transit coverage. But as far as what they had control over, it was just the municipal on-street parking. So that's where the impact would be.
Okay. Thanks, Joe. Jen.
Yeah, I guess it's hard. I'm getting curious about all three, and I know you all can only look deeply into one. I guess I was curious if any of your initial studies and literature review suggested either of the three being, and actually, is there a slide that kind of mentions all three so people can maybe look at it?
The previous slide to this
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. It like suggested that any of these might be a better or worse fit for Boston. I know in some of the conversations around New York style, I've heard people be like, oh, Boston, it would be hard to do that because we don't have as many clear like bridges that are points of entry into our like urban core. Like our urban core, it's not necessarily just one municipality, and it's it doesn't have as many clear boundaries to it. That said, it's very possible that such things are have been figured out by other municipalities. So I don't know how much credence to give that. I'm also interested in corridor-based. To me, it would be interesting to understand how much of regional traffic is entering the urban core via those highways, and how much isn't. And I think that might be like a determinant of like, okay, if we were really going to try to like, could this be effective? I'm assuming that option would also require a lot of work to prevent the diversions or like folks, taking smaller roadways or local roads. I'd also be interested in kind of, have there been examples of where that tolling could take place? I believe to toll those major highways would involve a lot of like potentially legislation. Like I'm not fully aware of what that would require. I don't know if there's been examples of ramps being tolled, because that, or like at the interface of state-owned highway and a municipal owned roadway. Is that something municipalities could or region could undertake? Maybe without a more complex legislative process. So those are questions that I have in mind. Those aren't necessarily a pitch for or against one strategy.
Thanks, Jen. Len?
Well, when it comes to the parking pricing, so yes, there may be a limited number of on-street parking, that we have the ability to control. But we do also will have the ability to control parking for T lots, commuter rail lots, and I think we can adjust the pricing on that, and maybe even some pricing with respect to access to the T itself that can make it more appealing. And that may even involve building more parking, in places where we think it'd be a good place to capture people who are driving, into the city. And we may even be able to work with businesses, to have them adjust the pricing that they how they price their parking. So I think there are lots of creative things that we can do that may not be in any empirical data, but maybe we can get some insights into that data by using our TDM model, to explore what would happen. Because the nice thing about exploratory modeling is that you can change the values for various parameters to get a sense of as to where the results aggregate. So not that Marty needs more work, but hey, Marty can handle it. So that's bringing him into the mix to get us some data. That's not necessarily empirical, but could be insightful. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you. Just quickly to Jen's question about sort of the sort of if there's a consensus on what type would work best in Boston. I don't think a consistent narrative has emerged on that. Nothing, I don't think, particularly backed by data that we could find. I think the conversation around roadway pricing generally, we can all agree, is in its very early stages in this region in particular. So I think for the purposes of this study, we're willing to try any of the three. We're not as much worried about the logistical or implementation concerns as much as our own ability to analyze what the impacts of such a system might be in this work. So, all right.
Jen, do you want to speak again?
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, maybe my initial inclination is, well, I think we should continue doing some follow-up on parking pricing, because I think it's a very like we could do a lot more with it. I think I'm a little bit more interested in seeing what, like, exploring a cordon-based or corridor-based, just because those, or at least having the MPO take a look at those two, because I think those are ones where you would, if we were going to be enacting something like that, we would need to be really, it's going to take a long time to think about it, develop it. We haven't had a consistent narrative kind of, like preference emerge in the region. And I think I could see a strong role for the MPO, MAPC, like regional action to bring together, or coalesce folks around something. Parking pricing, maybe the case could be made that there could be regional action around that, but it does seem very like it would need to be enacted on a very on a municipal basis could be a pretty fragmented way, and I could just see it not being harder to bring a cohesive program together. That said, not impossible. So curious to see if anyone had thoughts around that.
Joe, do you want to take that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part of that?
Oh, just like, at least in my head, I'm having a harder time seeing how from our places like the MPO board and kind of creating the right set of conditions that would bring all of the individual municipalities, I guess, in the urban core of the Boston region, along in creating a parking pricing kind of as a roadway congestion management tool, in that it is a lot of different individual municipal actors who would need to be kind of making that pitch in a coordinated way. Not to say that it hasn't happened, but even just like the Washington, D.C. example here, that's a very different situation. So I don't know if we have an example of a region that looks like ours and is as fragmented as ours undertaking something like this together.
Right. And I think particularly for this study, the data that's available is on the municipal level. And the data availability varies greatly across municipalities. I think that's something that we've been talking about as a staff is sort of regional parking data, and how it could support regional conversations around parking. So I think in the context of this particular work, it probably would be something on the municipal level where we do have the data to support that kind of analysis. But it's, could again, this is sort of an trying to evaluate our own capacity and provide a starting point for more regional discussions going forward. So given where the data is at now for this work, I think the parking would be on a more municipal basis.
Yeah, but Jen, I do think that point makes sense, that maybe looking at the other scenarios where the MPO would play a stronger role might make sense for this work. Yeah.
Lynn Diggins.
And I see your concern, Jen, but I see the need to work with for the municipalities to interact with each other more as a feature, not a bug. And yes, it takes more time and effort, but I think in the process, we understand each other better, and it builds a certain resilience. When we really do get stressed by external factors, we really know each other. And even if we may disagree on certain elements, of a policy that's aimed in the same direction, we can band together when we really need to. And also, I think it provides some nice experimentation, because one municipality may price at a rate that's different than another. You kind of get some data from that. But my big pitch for the parking for using parking pricing is that it can be that and the other two, or either the other two. So don't think of it as parking pricing only. So I think it would work well. In addition to one of the other policies, because that in itself would say, okay, think about, you may feel that you're being imposed upon by the corridor pricing, but if at your end point you don't like what's going to happen there, then you may have less incentive already, to get onto one of those corridors that has a fee. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you, Joe and Rose. Good discussion today. I think we'll move over to any remaining public comments. Oh, Steve, I see your hand up. Sorry.
Yes, back to the cordon based. I think we're actually very similar to New York City, and it wouldn't be hard to do in Boston. You have the Longfellow Bridge, the Gareth and O'Brien Highway at the Science Museum, and there's just a few exits off of 93, and then Mass Avenue, which really doesn't have that many streets off of it, heading into it. And you could create a district like that, which is be very similar to what we created in New York City. So certainly we should keep that into consideration. I think all three of these we should be looking at equally. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. All right. Well, thanks again, Joe and Rose. So I'll just go to any remaining public comments. Let's see. Yep, John. Here we go. John Strauss.
Yep. Thanks very much, Jay. I just had a couple of points. One, when you start doing the demographic studies, we have to be aware of patients going to hospitals. Are they going to get whacked when they go to see their doctor? Both in the roadway pricing and in the parking. Here in Burlington, people in Burlington, when they go to the Leahy Clinic, don't have to pay to park. That's one of the concessions that Leahy made, for the concessions we give them. So that's something that maybe you could put into the study when that begins. The other thing, when we start parking pricing in the different municipalities, is this going to be like the tariff wars, Are we going to penalize people coming in from a certain community that penalizes us if we go park there? Or is this going to be something, as Len says, to try to make a region-wide agreement?
Thanks, John. Scott Mullen.
Thanks, Jay. Scott Mullen here from A Better City, the TDM director. Looking at these three options, something jumps out to me is, the corridor scenario. We already have that, right? We've got the pike, we've got the tunnels. We can sort of learn from what we've experienced through the time that those have been operating. Cordon, we've never done. We can watch New York, but I think that's probably the one in my mind that deserves the closest scrutiny. Parking, I mean, there's so many different municipalities. The MPO doesn't control that. It should be in conjunction. I think Glenn Diggett's made that point, is parking right? And Genro talked about sort of installing potential speed humps and other mitigation to deal with runoff, right? If people are going to avoid a now tolled corridor. So I think it's definitely coordination is key. But I would say in my mind, it's the Cordon scenario here that is the most interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Anybody else? All right, hearing none. On to any member items. And seeing none, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moves, says Len Diggins.
Jen?
So second, says
All
Joe.
right. Thanks, everybody. Good discussion.
All right,
We'll
take care.
see you
Bye-bye.
soon. All right, bye-bye.